Looking back, it's strange how quiet the beginning of the end can be. Our story started like so many others: sparks, late night calls, dreams painted in shade of forever. Michael and I met in our final year of university. He was the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room: charming, confident, charismatic. I was quieter, more reserved, drawn to his energy like a moth to flame. He said all the right things. He made me feel seen, chosen. We moved fast. Within 2 years, we were married in a garden ceremony beneath golden autumn leaves. He kissed my forehead during our vows, whispered promises of forever that made my heart flutter. The early years were good, beautiful, even. We travelled. We hosted friends. We bought our first home, a modest 2-story with an overgrown backyard we promised to tame together. I planted a garden. He painted the fence. We laughed a lot in those days. I remember the mornings best. He'd bring me coffee in bed, humming some half-remembered tune. Max, our golden retriever, would curl up between us as we talked about everything and nothing. Those were the moments I held on to long after things started to change. It was gradual, imperceptible at first. Work got busier. Dinners became quicker, lie less frequent. He started working late more often. I didn't question it. I was proud of his success, proud to support him. I thought we were building something together. But cracks don't always start with earthquakes. Sometimes they're just tiny fractures in the foundation, hidden beneath layers of routine. I didn't notice the distance growing between us because I was too busy trying to close it. I signed up for cooking classes, thinking new recipes might rekindle something. I planned little getaways, bought him thoughtful gifts, wore the perfume he used to love. He smiled, thanked me, kissed my cheek. But his eyes had already started looking elsewhere. I didn't know it yet. Not then. But the man I had built a life with, a man who once made me feel like the center of his world, was already slipping away. At first, I blamed the seasons. Winter dulled everything. Maybe that was why he seemed so cold. Maybe the long hours at work, a stress, the darker evenings, maybe they were the reason we were talking less, touching less. I tried not to dwell on it. I buried myself in hobbies, hoping to find distractions that would also reignite something between us. I started baking, leaving warm loaves of bread on the counter when he got home. I wrote him little notes, some sweet, some flirty, and slipped them into his pockets. Sometimes he noticed, sometimes he didn't. He started sharing immediately when he came home. I asked how his day was, and he'd respond with a vague fine before disappearing upstairs. He stopped kissing me goodbye in the mornings. He said it was because he was always running late. But he'd never been late before. He changed his passwords. He started keeping his phone face down. One night I walked past the bathroom and saw him texting with a smile on his face. He didn't hear me. He was laughing at something on the screen. That laugh, I hadn't heard it in weeks. I wanted to believe it was innocent. I told myself it had to be. But even then, I knew. We went out less. He started making excuses when I suggested dinner with friends or movie nights at home. He was tired. He had meetings. He needed to catch up on sleep. And yet, he had energy to go out with coworkers. I watched him drift from me in real time. It was like watching someone erase themselves from a photo, one pixel at a time. The worst part was pretending not to notice, pretending not to hurt, because acknowledging it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for real. So I smiled. I asked about his day. I kept the house clean. I maintained the facade. It was easier to perform than to confront. Until the night he came home smelling like perfume I didn't own. I froze. Not because of the scent, but because he didn't even bother hiding it. He kissed me on the cheek, set down his bag, and walked past me as though everything were normal. As though I wouldn't notice the trace of another woman on his collar. That was when the last of my denial cracked, and the foundation we had built our life on began to crumble. It started with a credit card charge I didn't recognize. A boutique hotel in the city, not one we had ever stayed at. Not one he would have used for work. I checked the date. It was the same night he'd claimed to be at a business conference out of town. My chest tightened. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. So I did what I had never done before in our marriage. I snooped. It felt like trespassing. I told myself I was just looking for reassurance, not proof. His laptop was unlocked. I opened his browser. I stared at his search history. It was filled with things that didn't belong to our life: romantic restaurants, floral delivery services, jewelry not meant for me. Then the emails. There were dozens, tucked into a hidden folder under a pseudonym I didn't recognize. Messages filled with private jokes, plans for rendezvous, photos I wish I hadn't seen. Her name was Danielle. I remembered her from one of his office parties, tall, poised, overly friendly. There it was. My nightmare confirmed in black and white. I sat in silence for what felt like hours. My heart was racing, but the rest of me was eerily calm. No screaming, no tears, just a profound, hollow quiet. That night, I watched him sleep. I wondered how he could lie beside me, our dog curled between us, while he lived a second life. I thought about the lies, the betrayal, the deliberate cruelty of it all. And yet, I said nothing. Not yet. Instead, I began documenting everything. I copied the emails to a flash drive. I printed the photos. I created a folder on my computer called House Projects in case he ever stumbled across it. Inside, I stored my heartbreak. I followed him once, told him I was having brunch with a friend. Instead, I parked across the street from the hotel. I saw them together. He opened her car door. He held her waist as they entered. It wasn't a fling. It was a romance, a replacement. And yet he came home to me. He kissed me with the same mouth he used to whisper to her. That night, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The woman staring back was not broken. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was calculating. Because now, I knew. And knowledge is a dangerous thing when wielded by a woman who has been betrayed. I no longer needed to ask questions. I had every answer I needed. I just hadn't decided what to do with them. Yet. Revenge didn't come to me in a flash of fury. It came like a tight slope, steady, inevitable. There was no shouting match, no shattered plates, just the growing certainty that I had to act. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to fix things. I stopped making excuses, stopped blaming myself, and I started planning. Michael had taught me something over the years, without meaning to, how to manipulate appearances, how to mask emotion, manage impressions, maintain an image. He was always careful about optics. He cared deeply about how others saw us, saw him. Perfect couple. The enviable life. So I began to use that image as a weapon. I backed up everything. Screenshots of emails, hotel receipts, photos. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet. Within a week, I had a folder of evidence too damning to deny. There they were, Michael and Danielle embracing outside a hotel, hissing in his car, walking hand in hand through a park like teenagers. The investigator gave me everything with professional detachment. I accepted the folder, went home, and placed it in our safe right next to our wedding album. Then I began to prepare the mask. I played the role of the loving wife flawlessly. I laughed at his jokes again. I made his favourite meals. I even suggested a weekend getaway, something to reconnect. He agreed, a little too eagerly, clearly hoping to soothe whatever suspicions he thought I might have. That was his pattern, cover the cracks with surface gestures. He had no idea I was already gone. I saw a lawyer, a brilliant, ruthless woman recommended by one of my clients. We met in secret, planned the divorce meticulously. Since Michael and I had no prenup, and I had contributed significantly to the growth of our shared assets, the odds were in my favour. But I didn't want just money. I wanted the truth to matter. So I began orchestrating the fall. I started talking to our mutual friends again, and ones we'd slowly lost touch with as Michael climbed higher into his curated circle. I reconnected with old colleagues, hosted a brunch, shared subtle stories about how distant he'd become, how worried I was. I never accused him outright. I just planted doubt, watered it. I staged a few social media posts, smiling photos, cozy captions, but with just enough melancholy to suggest something wasn't right. I knew people would notice, and they did. Then I waited. The weekend getaway arrived. A cozy mountain lodge. The kind of place he used to say was too quiet, but now claimed was exactly what we needed. I pretended to relax. I let him believe the illusion that his charm was working, that our marriage was healing. He didn't know that while we toasted by the fire, my lawyer was filing the initial papers. He didn't know that a copy of the infidelity evidence had been sent anonymously to Daniel's firm. He didn't know that I had already emptied half of our joint accounts into a trust. And he didn't know that by Monday, his world would begin to unravel. The Monday after our mountain getaway began like any other, at least on the surface. Michael kissed my forehead as he left for work, a gesture he thought meant something. I smiled, handed him his lunch, and waved from the doorway as his car disappeared down the street. Inside, I closed the door and locked it. Then I exhaled. The wheels had already been set in motion. My lawyer had filed the divorce petition. Copies of the infidelity evidence were en route to his workplace in department. Danielle's firm where she was up for a promotion would receive an anonymous tip accompanied by just enough proof to warrant an internal review. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun. By noon, he called me. His voice was tight, controlled. "Hey, did you send anything to my office?" I told him no, feigning confusion. He didn't push. Not yet. But I could feel the unravelling begin. By Wednesday, his phone calls came more frequently. Short. Panicked. Accusatory. I maintained my role. I was the loyal wife, blindsided and confused. I played innocent so well, even he doubted his instincts. Then came Friday. That morning, I visited our bank. The trust fund had been secured. The joint accounts had been halved weeks ago. I signed final documents transferring property titles into my name, all prearranged with legal precision. He didn't know yet. I returned home to find him waiting in the kitchen, tie undone, sleeves rolled up. His face was pale, eyes frantic. He asked again, directly this time. "Did you do this to me?" I met his gaze and asked softly, "Do what?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The weight of consequence had finally crashed down around him. The next week was chaos, calls from lawyers, from meetings, tearful voicemails from Danielle. He tried to pivot, to control the narrative. But he couldn't escape the evidence. Every mask he wore slipped, one by one. His reputation, carefully cultivated over years, was stained. Promotion he had been promised was rescinded. His name quietly removed from high-profile projects. Danielle was let go. Her engagement, yes, she had been engaged, was called off, verifying. And I didn't gloat. I moved with grace. I gave statements when needed. I showed no anger, only quiet, weary sadness. Everyone saw me as the wronged woman, dignified and composed. But inside, I was fire. He tried to win me back, of course. Flowers, apologies, tearful pleas about starting over. He said it was a mistake, that he had lost himself. But I didn't want him back. I didn't want a man who only saw my worth once it became weaponized. The last time we spoke face to face was during mediation. He looked worn thinner, eyes hollow. He asked how I could be so calm. I told him, "Because I've already grieved, you just didn't notice." He signed the papers. I walked away, free. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was quieterly so. Michael tried to pick up the pieces of his fractured image, but everything he touched seemed to crumble. Friends we once shared stopped calling. Invitations stopped coming. Even his co-workers, once eager to praise him, became polite but distant. He was still employed, but the climb had halted. Promotions became out of reach. The project leads were reassigned. I had never seen him doubt himself before, but now I could see the weight of consequence in his posture, his silence. Danielle had vanished from his life. I heard, through quiet whispers, that her fianc had exposed the affair, public emails, photos, everything. She was forced to resign from her firm. Her social media disappeared. She became a ghost of the scandal that had briefly burned so brightly. And me, I was becoming something new. I returned to work with a quiet strength. My clients, once acquaintances, became advocates. I joined a fitness class, not to change how I looked, but to feel the beat of my own heart again. I went to a writing group on Thursdays and finally started the novel I had always dreamed of. The house, once echoing with silence and suspicion, felt alive again. Max stayed close to me, always watching, always understanding. I painted the bedroom a new colour. I bought new sheets. I filled the walls with art that reflected who I was, not who we had been. Michael reached out, of course. He tried everything. Messages that range from pitiful to angry. Apologies wrapped in self-pity. Offers to go to therapy. Promises he was a changed man. But I didn't respond. I had no more words for him. One day, a bouquet arrived at my door. White lilies, my favourite, though he hadn't sent them in years. I took the card, read the short apology, and placed the flowers in the compost bin. Because I wasn't mourning anymore. I was planting something new. Word spread about the divorce. Most people didn't ask questions they didn't need to. The story had told itself in whispers and silences. I held my head high, Not because I wanted to look strong, but because I finally felt it. There was a moment about a month after the papers were finalised when I saw him again. We passed on the street. He looked older, dimmer. He opened his mouth as if to speak. I nodded politely, and I kept walking. The day of the confrontation wasn't planned. It came uninvited, like so many truths do. I was leaving the bookstore, arms full of paperbacks and the scent of new pages still lingering, when I saw him standing outside the Cove across the street. Michael, alone. A coffee cup in one hand, the other shoved into his coat pocket, as if he were trying to shrink into himself. He saw me too, and this time he didn't look away. He crossed the street, slowly, cautiously, like someone approaching a stray animal afraid it might bolt or bite. I didn't move. I wasn't afraid. He stopped a few feet in front of me. I miss you, he said, voice low, face hollow. Every day. I said nothing. The silence was louder than any accusation I could have made. He started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears quietly spilling down his face as he talked about mistakes and regrets, how he couldn't sleep, how nothing felt real without me. I listened not because I needed to hear it, but because I needed to know that he did. When he finished, I asked just one question, why her? He didn't have an answer, just excuses dressed in confusion. He blamed stress, temptation, loneliness. He said things had felt off between us and she'd made him feel alive again. It was a strange thing to hear, knowing I had spent months trying to revive something he'd already buried. I thought I wanted something different, he said. But it was never real. It wasn't love. And what we had was, I asked. He looked at me then, not the woman he had betrayed, but the woman he'd lost. And I saw it, the recognition of what he had thrown away. I'm sorry, he whispered. And I believed him. But belief didn't mean forgiveness. You should be, I replied. But not for me, for you. Because he was the one who had to live with it. With the memory of what he shattered. With the knowledge that the woman who had once loved him beyond reason now looked at him without feeling. I walked away. And I didn't look back. Healing didn't come with a sunrise. It didn't arrive in one sweeping moment of peace or clarity. It came in fragments, slow, unexpected, often when I wasn't looking for it. I started waking up without dread. At first just once or twice a week. Then more regularly. The weight on my chest that had become a permanent fixture began to lift. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to smile through pain or shrink myself for someone else's comfort. I reclaimed my mornings. Coffee in hand, Max at my feet, sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows. I began writing again, not just grocery lists or work emails, but real writing. The kind that came from the soul. I filled pages with thoughts, reflections, poetry. Things I'd forgotten I was capable of. I travelled alone. I went to Paris and stood on the Pont des Arts watching couples attach their locks to the railing and felt no envy, just peace. I hiked a trail in the Rockies that Michael always said was too long and stood at the summit alone, tears streaming down my face not from sadness but from sheer, staggering freedom. I hosted dinners with friends, laughed loudly, danced in my living room in my pyjamas. I redecorated the house, painting over the rooms we once chose together with colours that reflected me, not us. Just me. And slowly I learned to love solitude, not as a consolation prize, but as a gift. I met new people. I didn't rush into anything romantic. I didn't need to. I had already rebuilt the most important relationship in my life, one with myself. When Michael's name came up in conversation, I didn't flinch. I didn't fume. He had become a closed chapter, an echo of a life I no longer lived. He reached out sometimes, short messages, check-ins. I never responded, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. One morning, I walked past the old garden bed he used to complain about, now blooming with fresh lavender and wildflowers I had planted myself. Max trotted beside me, tail wagging, and for the first time in a long time I felt whole, not because I had moved on, but because I had come home to myself. Months passed. Seasons changed. Life carried on in a rhythm I had come to cherish, quiet, stable, filled with small joys. But grief has its own gravity, and sometimes, even when you've let go, it tugs at you unexpectedly. It happened one rainy evening in late autumn. I received a letter, an actual letter, handwritten, the envelope smudged by the weather. The handwriting was unmistakable. Michael's. I sat at the kitchen table, Max curled at my feet, and stared at the envelope for a long time. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it would say. Apologies, regret, maybe even longing. But I opened it anyway. He wrote of memories of mistakes. He said he saw now what he had lost, what he had destroyed. That his world felt hollow without me. That he missed the mornings with coffee and Max, the quiet companionship. That Danielle was long gone. That he had made a terrible mistake. He said he hoped I was happy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. Not of him, but of the journey. The distance I had travelled from who I was then to who I had become. I didn't feel anger reading his words. I didn't feel much at all. And maybe that was the greatest freedom of all, the absence of pain. The echo of silence where once there had been chaos. That night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the rain fall in silver threads. I breathed deeply, feeling the damp air fill my lungs. And I smiled. Not for what was. Not for what could have been. But for what I had built from the ruins. There's something profound about walking into your own life with both hands open, no longer clinging to the past, no longer seeking validation, simply existing in the fullness of who you've become. That was me, now. The woman I never imagined I'd have to be, but who I'd grown into with strength forged from heartbreak. I started mentoring at a women's centre in the city. It began with one evening a month, then slowly became a calling. Women came with their stories, some different, some nearly similar to mine, and I listened, nodded, offered what I could. My story became more than pain. It became a blueprint for survival. People said I looked different, lighter, more radiant. I suppose I was. There's a glow that comes not from makeup or sunlight, but from the sheer relief of no longer pretending. I smiled more, laughed from my belly, danced in the grocery aisle if a song I loved came on. I started saying yes to things that scared me, solo travel, public speaking, writing workshops. I even began publishing essays under my own name. Each word I wrote was a step farther from the shadow of the life I had left behind. And then one day, without even trying, I met someone. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't sweeping declarations. It was quiet and slow, like a soft rain after a long drought. We talked for hours about books, grief, resilience. He had his own scars. He didn't try to fix mine. But this wasn't a story about finding love again. This was a story about finding me. He just happened to walk beside me as I did. The past has a strange way of fading, not erasing, but softening, like a photograph left in the sun. I still remembered the pain, but it no longer ruled me. It no longer shaped every choice. It had become just one thread in the tapestry of my life. Years passed. I published my first book, a memoir. It wasn't about Michael. Not directly. It was about silence, survival, the cost of loyalty, and the strength that grows in its space. The book resonated. Letters poured in. Women who felt seen. Men who felt challenged. People who had stayed too long in places that diminished them. I was invited to speak at conferences. I led writing retreats in the mountains. I stood in front of audiences with my voice steady, my hands open, no longer afraid. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and smile. Not because I was flawless, but because I was finally whole. I saw Michael once, by chance, at a bookstore, of all places. He was older, so was I. He looked tired. Our eyes met. He gave me a small nod. I returned it. Then I turned away. Closure doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes in silence. In knowing you no longer need an apology to move on. That the story isn't about him anymore. It never really was. I walked out of the store, the cold air sharp and clean. I pulled my coat tight and made my way home. Max was older now too, slower on his feet, but still full of heart. He met me at the door like always, tail wagging. As I sat down at my desk that night, the lamp casting a golden glow, I opened a fresh page in my journal and wrote, I am not the woman who was left. I am the woman who rose. And I believed it. There's a strange kind of peace in realizing some wounds will never be explicitly healed. Some apologies will never come and some bridges will never be rebuilt. I learned this not in anger or bitterness, but in quiet acceptance. After the divorce was finalized, after the public unraveling of Michael's carefully curated life, I waited. Not for a grand confession, not for tears or regret, but for any sign that he recognized the damage done not just to me, but to himself. But the apology never came. I heard whispers. Few mutual friends mentioned Michael's silence, his avoidance, his own struggles with guilt and shame, but not a word addressed to me. No message. No attempt to reconnect or explain. At first, the absence stung. I imagined what I would have said if he had reached out. I imagined conversations that would never happen. Then, slowly understood, some people are not capable of saying sorry not because they don't feel it, but because it is easier to live with denial than face the consequences of truth. That knowledge paradoxically freed me. I didn't need his apology to heal. I didn't need Michael's acknowledgement to move forward. I had built my own apology to myself. A promise that I would never let anyone diminish my worth again. And in that promise, I found my truest peace. Starting over wasn't about erasing the past, it was about redesigning my future on my own terms. I began to make choices that reflected who I had become, not who I had been. I sought relationships rooted in respect, not convenience. I embraced opportunities that challenged me instead of fearing failure. I cultivated friendships that lifted me up rather than drained me. I moved into a smaller apartment filled with sunlight and plants. The space felt like a fresh canvas, a quiet decoration that I was ready to create something beautiful from the fragments. Work became more than just a paycheck, it became a mission. I volunteered with organizations supporting women escaping toxic relationships. I used my voice to speak at events, to write articles, to mentor those who felt trapped in silence. Every morning, I'd look in the mirror and say, "This is your life now, build it wisely." It wasn't easy. Old fears lingered, doubts whispered. But I met each one with the fierce determination of someone who had seen the worst and survived. And slowly, steadily, I built a life that was authentically mine, a life that no betrayal could ever break. The story I lived became the story I told, not just for myself, but for others. Letters arrived from women I never met, sharing their own journeys through heartbreak, betrayal, and rebirth. They told me how my words gave them strength to leave toxic situations, to find their own voices, to reclaim their power. I began hosting workshop spaces where stories could be shared without judgment, where healing began in community. Watching these women transform reminded me how far I'd come, and how important it was to turn pain into purpose. The legacy I built was not in material things or accolades, but in these connections, the lives touched by honesty, resilience, and hope. I realized then that my story, once defined by loss, had become a beacon, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real, because it was human. Because it was a testament to the strength that rises when we refuse to be broken. If I could speak to the woman I once was, a one who believed in fairy tales, and forever I would tell her this: you are stronger than you know. The cracks you fear will break you, are the very places where light will shine through. The pain you feel is not the end, but the beginning of a new story, a story only you can write. You will face betrayal, loss, and silence that feels endless. But remember, you are not defined by the actions of others. You will rise again and again until the woman in the mirror is someone you recognize and respect. Trust yourself. Hold tight to hope, even when it feels like it's slipping away. And above all, know this: your worth is not tied to another's love or loyalty. It lives inside you, unbreakable and true. This is your life, your journey, your healing. And I am proud of the woman you will become.